the people who are not getting the benefit of the vaccine, a lot of it is because they're just, they're on social media, they're getting fed misinformation. And by the way, we also know the Russians are involved. This is part of this, mission of their divisiveness. And we haven't had a counteroffensive in this country to all this misinformation. And in fact, I pleaded with Vivek Murthy, our Surgeon General, back in May to do that. And I think you saw just last week, he did make that announcement, but it hasn't really been aggressive. It isn't calling out the sources of this. So what we have is a problem of lots of misinformation, some of it quite deliberate, and lack of a counter.
Yeah. The reason why this is so upside down is you have many, many millions of people who believe some combination of the following: that the risk of COVID, the disease, has been vastly exaggerated, right? COVID is a hoax, or it's just a flu, or it's just not a factor. But the vaccines are scary and dangerous, right? So it's we just have literally tens of millions of people who are totally sanguine about the prospect of catching COVID, but really averse to the idea of getting vaccinated for COVID. And obviously, from our point of view, that's totally upside down. But this is the balance that has to be, the results of which have to be fairly judged. I mean, on the one side, you have the risk of COVID plus the effectiveness of the vaccines weighed against the risks of vaccination. Because, this is really a forced choice for all of us. Unless you're going to be perfectly in hiding, you're going to be exposed to the novel coronavirus, and it's some variant or many variants thereof. And you can either be exposed having been fully vaccinated or not having been fully vaccinated. And this should be simple to talk about, and the comparative risks should be simple to assess now, because we have many, many millions of people who have run this experiment. We've got millions of people who have caught COVID without the benefit of a vaccine. We've got millions of people who've been vaccinated, and we can assess the negative side effects of getting these vaccines. All of this can be assessed, but again, this is happening in a context where many, many millions of people believe that, for instance, everything that has been going on here has been part of a vast totalitarian conspiracy. I mean, there are people who think that the lockdowns and the masking has been not for the purpose of mitigating real illness. The whole point has been to acclimatize otherwise free societies to regimes of extreme social control, right? And then you add to that paranoia the belief that any emphasis on vaccination rather than treatment of COVID with existing compounds like ivermectin, that's based on a pure profit motive coming from big pharma and the mercenary manipulation of government, right? We're all doing the bidding somehow of Pfizer and Moderna.
Right.
I mean, so I can say, for instance, someone's going to think that of us in this conversation. I mean, it should go without saying that I have absolutely no entanglement with big pharma, and
for me.
There's no pressure on me to do a podcast about the benefits of vaccines. So it's this is just a pure PSA from my point of view. But that's the environment in which we're having this conversation.
Yeah, I would add, I have no connections, conflicts with pharma. But even every day, people on Twitter say, you're a tool, you're a shill for pharma, when in fact I've been attacking them throughout in fact, before the vaccines were approved, I was attacking them for not posting their protocols,
right,
Moderna, Pfizer, and all the rest of them. And also,
he is a shill for big pharma in this way. He may not be getting paid for it, but he is doing their bidding. He's trying to get people to take a vaccine that is extremely dangerous. And because of that, he's a shill for them. There's just no other way to look at it. He is doing their bidding for them. Now, he may not be doing it on purpose, and Sam too. Most definitely, they're shills for big pharma. They may not be doing it on purpose. They may not be getting paid for it. I don't know about any of that stuff, and I highly doubt it. But Big Pharma is very happy that they're putting out podcasts like this, I can tell you. Excuse me.
Well, more recently for a premature pronouncement of need for boosters, and no, this is all, as you say, just part of that kind of multi-dimensional conspiracy accusal and theory, and it's saddening to watch and in a way be part of that. Yeah.
Okay, so what do we know about the effectiveness of the vaccines at this point?
Right. So the vaccines, when we had the first trials that came out in November, December, was a formal review, we learned that they were 95% effective, both Pfizer and then subsequently shortly after Moderna. That was against any infection. Or
Okay. That is completely wrong. He said they're 95% effective against any infection. Now this is a kind of a mathematical thing, so when the data came out, I made a very, very good video explaining what that 95% number truly was. It's not what you think it is. And I published this video and I got 1 million direct messages, not 1 million, I don't want to exaggerate. I got a huge number of direct messages from all kinds of doctors from all over the world thanking me for explaining all of this. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that video because the trials were testing for symptom reduction. That's all they were testing for. It wasn't testing for whether or not you would get the disease or hospitalization or death or anything like that. And the 95% number is the relative risk reduction. It's not the absolute risk reduction. I mean, there was so much deception with these numbers when they came out. It's unbelievable. The absolute risk reduction for the Pfizer vaccine is less than 1%. So it was a real opportunity for Big Pharma to confuse the public, to lie to them in a way about how effective these vaccines were. And I'm going to show you my video now, and it's very self-explanatory because I knew this was something that I wanted to explain fairly slowly to people because, even mathematicians don't understand quite what it's saying at first. But the way to understand these things is do some examples, and I'm going to do an example in the video I'm going to show you, and you're going to understand it plenty well by the end of this very short excerpt from the video that I made called Don't Get the Vaccine Until You See This. Here we go. This is me about 5 years ago doing this.
I got a hold of some of the data on the vaccine trials, and I wanted to explain mathematically what the values of important parameters are and what they imply. And we could sort of, even though we can't discuss it, I can kind of anticipate your questions and discuss it with you in a way. So when you go to make a decision on a vaccine, you want to know what the risks and the benefits are, of course. And you also need to know the chance that they will work, because even if there's a great benefit, if it only works in 1% of the people, then it may not be that valuable. So what do we mean by work anyway? For a vaccine to work, traditionally it meant that that vaccine prevented you from getting the disease if you encounter the pathogen in the future, right? We already know that the messenger RNA vaccines that have been in the news lately and that a lot of people have gotten do not prevent you from getting or spreading the disease. And believe it or not, a lot of people still do not realize that.
They don't. At this point, this was very early in 2021, And I'm already having to tell people that the vaccines do not prevent you from getting and spreading the disease, which I had proved. Again, I was the first in the world to prove it, and I had proved it in January, and I think I made this video in February, and the CDC data jocks hadn't figured it out yet. And they and Dr. Bhattacharya were telling me I was too early on figuring out this stuff. It was impossible to figure it out that quickly on such a small amount of data. But again, I used calculus to figure it out, and none of them had used calculus, and so I just did it much quicker than they were able to.
They assumed it was a vaccine, and they were told that there was a 95% efficacy, so they thought it prevented 95% of the recipients, for example, from getting the disease and spreading it. That is not the case, as many people know by now. All right, so if they...
But, that's what Eric Topol just told us. He said they were 95% effective at preventing the disease. That is exactly what he just said. So he didn't understand this either. Clearly did not understand the data at all. And it's shocking because Eric Topol has, as he said at the beginning, he's been conducting clinical trials most of his life, certainly of his life in medicine. And for him not to be able to figure out what the 95% number meant is scary. But anyway, let's continue here, and I'll explain it all to you very simply.
They don't help you prevent you from getting the disease, and they don't prevent you from spreading the disease. Do they do anything helpful? That's the question we're going to talk about tonight. And in that regard, what exactly does the 95% efficacy that Dr. Fauci has talked about and others, what does that actually mean? Well, I'm going to explain all of it to you tonight. First, we're going to go over 3 definitions of parameters that will help us be able to make sense out of the raw numbers, if you will. And the first one we're going to look at is absolute risk reduction. It is the percent of bad outcomes in the control group minus the percent of bad outcomes in the treated group when testing a treatment, okay? Now, suppose you have a randomized controlled trial of a treatment for some disease, okay? And by the way to understand these parameters, these definitions, is just to do a few examples and it'll be real clear. But you've got a randomized controlled trial here. 40% of those treated had a bad outcome versus 60% in the control group who had a bad outcome. So the ARR would be 60% minus 40% equals 20%. Okay? So what does that mean in everyday, ordinary English conversation? 20% of what? Well, let's get a little bit more detailed on our example and it'll become very clear what conclusions you can draw from that. So suppose that there's this disease out there that causes blindness, and a very smart scientist has synthesized a molecule that he thinks will reduce the chance of blindness, the incidence of blindness in the people who get that disease. So they want to test it scientifically, and they take 100 people in the control group, those are the people that will not have the treatment, and 100 people in the treated group, and they must also set that term I use, bad outcome, to something. And it's fairly obvious in that case, they would probably set the bad outcome at blindness, okay? So in the example we just gave, applying the numbers here, we'd have 60 people who became blind in the control group. Those are the people that did not get the treatment, and 40 in the treated group, okay? So again, the ARR is going to be percent of bad outcomes or percent of blindness in the control group minus the percent of blindness in the treated group. So the ARR would be 20%. Okay, now, so what that means is that you could conclude from that for every 100 patients you treat in the general population, 20 of those 100 will avoid becoming blind. Okay, that's what that trial shows you. All right? The relative risk is the proportion of bad outcomes in the treated group divided by the proportion of bad outcomes in the control group. And we sure do hope that number is less than 1, because if it was greater than 1, it would imply that the treatments had made things worse, okay? So in the example we gave, it would be 40% divided by 60% equals 0.67 for the relative risk. By the way, it's very hard to understand things like that the first time anybody hears it. So if you don't quite understand the ARR and the RR and the triple R and the things I'm going to show you, you can go back and look at it and go over it. Because when we plug in the numbers from COVID, you're going to get some results that might surprise you. And that's why that was the reason I made the video. All right. The relative risk reduction is the percent reduction in bad outcomes compared to the control group. Okay? So in the example we keep using, 60% of the people in the control group got blind. But that got reduced down to 40% in the treated group, if you will. So the percent reduction is 60 minus 40, that was the reduction, divided by 60. So that would be the percent of 60 that was reduced. And that's 0.33, 1/3. So 20 over 60 is 1/3, and that would be the relative risk reduction in the example we gave. And just because of a little mathematical thing that I happen to know about, the relative risk reduction would also be 1 minus the relative risk. All right. So let's now look at what we came here to learn about, and that's the Moderna and Pfizer messenger RNA vaccines. First, they had to choose what the bad outcome would be. You know, would it be death? Would it be hospitalization? Would it be need for the ICU? Well, they did not choose those as the bad outcome. Their bad outcome was, well, let me just read it to you, or part of it, and sort of explain where they're coming from here. The endpoint, the primary efficacy endpoint, is really what the bad outcome is. Because if someone reaches the endpoint, they go in the group that experience the bad outcome. Sorry for being a little tongue-tied there. I think you'll understand this when we get through it. Let me just read it. At least 2 of the following symptoms. A patient that experiences at least 2 of the following symptoms: fever, chills, myalgia, headache, sore throat, etc., typical symptoms, or at least 1 of the following respiratory symptoms, such as radiological evidence such as cough, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, or finally, radiological evidence of pneumonia, etc., in combination with a positive PCR test. But the point I'm trying to make is their bad outcome is 2 or more of the following symptoms, or at least 1 respiratory symptom, etc. Okay? And then Pfizer, very similarly, listed a bunch of symptoms. They said the presence of at least 1 of the following symptoms and a positive PCR test, of course: fever, new or increased cough, new shortness of breath, chills, etc. Okay, loss of taste or smell. So what the trials were designed to measure did not have anything to do with preventing, well, let me say it this way. The bad outcome that was chosen was either 1 or 2 symptoms in different categories that the patient might experience. That's how they measured the efficacy of the vaccines, whether it could prevent some symptoms, basically. Okay? Now, here's something that's really important about this. Again, this is one of these things that motivates me to do these videos and explain to people who might be watching TV primarily for their understanding of all this. As you can see from me reading the endpoints, they're all about numbers of symptoms. 2 from this category, 1 from this category, etc. They do not in any way measure the vaccine's ability to prevent a recipient from getting infected or prevent a recipient from spreading the disease. Okay? And yet, on television every day, I see the TV doctors and the bureaucratic doctors tell the public that we need to get everyone vaccinated so we can get to herd immunity. But the vaccine trials did not measure the ability of the vaccine to block someone from getting the disease or block them from transmitting it, which is what is involved in reaching herd immunity. You know, you want the people in the population to not be able to transmit it to the next person, but that wasn't involved at all in the vaccine trials. So it's beyond me why they keep saying something like that. Basically, that has nothing to do with what the vaccines were tested for. Okay, and we know, like I said earlier, that they do not prevent people from getting the disease or transmitting it. So I'm not really sure why the doctors keep saying this. Okay, is all it really does is the only thing that's been measured is their ability to reduce symptom number. Okay, let's go over the raw data from the Pfizer trials, and I'll apply it to the formulas for the parameters that I mentioned before. We'll talk about the implications. So in the Pfizer trials, we'll take first, and then I'll just read you the results from the Moderna trial, so we don't have to do it twice. But in the Pfizer trials, you had over 18,000 participants in both the control group and the vaccinated group. A lot of people there. And only 8 patients in the vaccinated group reached the primary efficacy endpoint, which is the bad outcome. Remember, we talked about that. You used that term before. That reached that endpoint, which we'll call PEE from now on. Only 8 patients in the vaccinated group. That looks pretty good, right? 162 reached it in the control group. That's the group that didn't get the vaccine, okay? So maybe that looks pretty good right there, but hold on to your hat for a second. All right, so let's plug it in. Remember, the absolute risk reduction is the percent of people reaching the PEE in the control group minus the percent reaching it in the vaccinated group. And we know that in the control group, 162 people reached it out of 18,000 plus in that group for a percent of 0.884. And in the vaccinated group, only 8 people reached it out of their very large 18,000 plus group, okay? For a percent of 0.044. And when you subtract these two, as per the definition of the absolute risk reduction, you get 0.84%. Now, just a quick implication from this. The absolute risk reduction of getting the vaccine is less than 1%. Okay? Just think about that for a second. Only less than 1% in risk reduction from getting that vaccine? Okay. Let's move on, and I'll show you how important these implications are in just a second. All right. The relative risk is the number of participants who reach the endpoint in the vaccinated group divided by the number in the control group. And we've already calculated this. This is the number that reached it or the percent or the decimal that reached it in the vaccinated group. And you've got to divide that by the number that reached it in the control group. And when you do that, you get 5%. Okay? So the relative risk is 5%. The relative risk reduction is the percent reduction in reaching the endpoint compared to the controls. Okay? And I mentioned earlier that that's 1 minus the relative risk. And so that's 95% it comes out to be. 1 minus 5% is 95%. And that's what you're seeing on television about the vaccines being referred to as having a 95% efficacy, okay? Which sounds really good, doesn't it? I mean, you can imagine someone in the general public that is not, does not have this kind of background, possibly saying something like, wow, the vaccines are amazing. They have an efficacy of 95%, okay? Well, what does it all mean? It's going to surprise you quite possibly. It's not what you think. I have taken the liberty of listing the values that I just calculated with the raw numbers up here, the ARR, RR, and triple R. And I want to tell you sort of everyday, ordinary English conversation what this means so that you can think about something that may be more understandable instead of just a bunch of decimal numbers. Okay. We have established that the absolute risk reduction is 0.84%. What that means, that's less than 1% now. That means you have to give the vaccine to 119 people, 2 doses, that's 238 jabs, if you will, before you prevent just one person from benefiting. Okay? And the way I arrived at the 119, of course, is I divided 100 by 0.84. It's less than 1, so this number's got to be greater than 100. Okay? Think about this for a second. If you want to look at this another way, it means that someone who went through those 2 injections has an over 99% chance that they will not work. Okay? Think about that. Because you need to go to more than 100 people before you find someone that it works on, right? Because it's a less than 1% risk reduction, okay? Think about that for a second. Let it just sort of go in, go over it again if you have to. Because at first you go, what? What is that? Think of it this way. Let's see. If the chance was 1%, not 0.84%, there was a 1% risk reduction. And you check one person, it's not likely that they got a risk reduction because the chance is only 1% that it would have happened. You know, you got to go all the way up to 100 people before somebody gets a risk reduction. In other words, a benefit from the vaccine. Okay? But since it's less than 1%, you got to go beyond 100 people before somebody gets it. All right. Now, given the side effects and the potential problems associated with these vaccines, and we're just learning and studying them now, there's potential for autoimmunity from these, and I'll tell you why later. There's horrible side effects from some of them, and they occur in great frequency. In some cases, 80% of the participants got side effects from the second vaccine and so forth.
So here's the thing that's very important to understand. You have to give the 2 shots to 119 people before just one person benefits. That's what the trial showed. And the benefit is one symptom reduction, basically. Isn't that amazing? I mean, would you take a vaccine that had over a 99% chance that they wouldn't work? I don't think I would. Not with a disease that is so benign, basically. I mean, it's atypical pneumonia. I'd rather take my chances on getting atypical pneumonia than I would wanting to get a vaccine that's so poisonous, which I'm going to explain later. I mean, it's just a no-brainer. But of course, Sam looks at it exactly the opposite. He thinks everybody should go get a vaccine that has over a 99% chance that they won't do anything. And to me, that makes no sense for a very treatable disease like atypical pneumonia. Just doesn't make any sense.
17% of which were very severe side effects. And we also know that patients have died from the vaccine. We don't know how many. It's very hard to find. I looked very hard for it, and I could not find the total up-to-date number. But the TV and bureaucratic doctors are pushing everyone, again, to get a vaccine that does not reduce transmissibility or infection and requires more than 100 people, 119 people, to get 2 jabs each before one person reduces his symptoms by one number, by one symptom. Because that is the endpoint. Think about it. If the endpoint, say, is 2 symptoms from this category and a positive PCR test, the way to drop them down into the other group that did not benefit from the vaccine would be to reduce those 2 symptoms down to 1. So you're talking about one person out of 119 getting the benefit of one symptom less than he had before as the benefit of the price you pay to make 119 people get a vaccine with all the side effects and horrible possible potential problems associated with it, which we'll get to. By the way, I will go into those in detail in the next video. This one is only about the mathematical implications of all the numbers. I'm going to make a separate video for the other part, for the possible problems we can have from these vaccines. All right. Now, let's look at the relative risk of 5% and the relative risk reduction of 95% and see what that implies. Well, you might think you're reducing something really bad by 95%. That's got to be great, doesn't it? It's really good. Well, not necessarily, because if the chance of getting to that endpoint is very, very low in the first place, and we know that only 162 out of 18,325 people did so in the untreated group, and it's reduced by 95%, it's not going to mean that much. Let me give you an example. Suppose I was a goofy high school student, not too hard to imagine. But I loved this beautiful girl in high school and I wanted to have a date with her. And let's say my chance was 1 in 1,000 of getting a date with her. And let's also put in the story that I used to wear white socks with loafers to school every day. So one of my friends comes up to me and he says, "Hey Reid, you can increase your chances by 95% of getting a date with her if you stop wearing white socks with your loafers and wear dark blue socks." Okay, and that could certainly be true, but it's not going to help my chances of getting. It's not going to help my chances of getting a date with her very much in reality, because my chance is only 1 in 1,000 anyway. Like knock it up 95%, and now it's just under 2 in 1,000. See, so when the chance of something happening is really, really, really small, having a relative risk reduction of 95% means almost nothing. It's not very valuable. Okay. Now, this is the number you've heard that number before, haven't you? 95%. We hear it on TV every day. The vaccines have 95% efficacy. The problem is there are so few people in the population that are getting to that level of having a number of symptoms, serious symptoms, that it doesn't mean that much. Okay, it's used almost, I hate to say it, as an advertisement to say the vaccine's better than it is. But I didn't go too far over the line there. But it doesn't tell the whole story, not by any stretch. It's way overstating the value of the vaccine. Let's put it that way. Now,
remember, the chances of reaching the primary efficacy endpoint in the control group, now this is the people that didn't even take the vaccine, is only 162 out of 18,350. So it's a minuscule chance of reaching the primary efficacy endpoint, and that was just a bunch of symptoms, including getting a positive PCR test. And we all know, I hope at this point, that the PCR test was a major fraud. You can't use it to diagnose diseases. But this is why the relative risk reduction, which is the thing that Eric Topol is quoting, is just a worthless number. It doesn't mean anything. And, in other words, the 162 over 18,000 is about the chance I had of getting the date with the beautiful girl. So reducing it by 95%, wonderful. Now my chances are 324 out of 18,000 and something. I mean, and they hung their hat on that number, and they were just deceiving the public like crazy. It's incredible, really. So let's go back to a contagion of bad ideas and disprove some more.